Hi, my name is Travis Gudenrath, and I'll be presenting my personal narrative presentation for my Interdisciplinary Studies course at Texas Tech University, Interdisciplinary Studies 2310, taught by Dr. Gibbs. So throughout this presentation, the main topics that I'll be covering are as follows. First, I'll outline a definition of integrative studies and how that is different from interdisciplinary studies, my own definition of integrative studies, and some values of integrative studies that I see that apply in my life today, in my life down the road, and possibly in the lives of others. On top of that, I'll be talking about continuity and discontinuity. What those terms mean I'll define later on in the presentation, but I'll be outlining and I'll be going over how discontinuity and continuity within discontinuity have played a role in my history, in my present day, and in my future academic and professional career. And finally talking about some connecting themes and some ideas throughout all of it, through continuity, discontinuity, integrative studies, tying it all together. But to begin, let's talk about integrative studies and a definition to start with. So the given definition from our literature that we've studied this semester through our interdisciplinary studies class comes from a publication by Dr. Klein about integrative studies and interdisciplinary approaches published in 2005. And the definition given within that literature follows along the lines of a process of applying knowledge, experience, and methods from various disciplines or approaches to solving an immediate problem. And so it's very broad and inclusive. In forming my own personal definition of integrative studies, I found that this definition was really helpful, and I got a little bit more specific, focusing on disciplines and their perspectives. And we'll talk in a second about why integrative studies is different from interdisciplinary studies. But the personal definition I find in my own life that fits the most is combining multiple disciplines, perspectives, and tools to best address a problem. And this definition was heavily influenced by Klein's perspective of it being an overarching process of reaching and pulling from different approaches to find what synthesized product fits best instead of a singular approach. So the big difference between integrative studies and interdisciplinary studies is interdisciplinary studies focuses solely on the combination of different perspectives from different disciplines, similar to my definition, right? Whereas integrative studies focus on the combination of different approaches, not just limited to disciplines, which is referring to academic disciplines, for an example, the medical discipline versus the engineering discipline versus, the literature discipline like English. That is an academic discipline, right? So what integrative studies means to me, there's four values that I see that apply in my life today, going forward, and possibly in the lives of others. The first and foremost being versatility, being versatile. Integrative studies enables me in my life today to pull from various approaches and topics to be most effective in addressing head-on whatever problem is in front of me in almost any situation, with minimal education on my part about the specific situation itself, and minimal reframing. It doesn't require a huge paradigm shift, but rather just a broad perspective, a more open mind. And it's easily adapted and changed to dynamic or chaotic situations. Like most human beings, the problems in my life are not static. They occur, and they continue to occur, often changing, developing new nuances as a result of variables that are being introduced and disappearing and introduced and disappearing. So I can't have a static solution to a dynamic problem. And where I see that applying in my future is as I continue through academia and eventually getting into a professional field, I'll encounter new problems that I'll have no really basis to go at other than combining different approaches from pre-existing knowledge from both academic disciplines such as the degrees that I'll earn, the education I'll get through college, but also life approaches. For example, being a person in long-term recovery, which for me means I haven't used alcohol and drugs since January 16th of 2017, pulling from the approaches I've learned through that experience as well. The second value is inclusivity. Integrative studies is not dogmatic or preferring one discipline or approach over another. It's this idea of taking a holistic approach to a problem, holistic in this case meaning looking at any and all types of approaches under this one big umbrella and picking and choosing the best parts from each for that specific problem. And this even includes being open to additional disciplines, right? But also focusing on one temporarily over another, different disciplines or approaches. Sometimes with one being best fit for a period of time in addressing a problem, and then the next stage of that problem requiring focusing more on one type of approach or discipline. Being able to do this type of change and adaptation without needing to discard anything is invaluable. And ties in with the third value I see in integrative studies in my life and possibly for others, longevity. This is a way of living, of reframing, of perspective that can last an entire lifetime, that has no need to really be discarded or really even refitted, as the nature of the perspective is to be constantly shifting and pulling the best parts from different approaches. And it's a flexible perspective that's very much able to withstand the changing tides of life and of situations. And the fourth value that I see is it's synthetic, it's created. It's not a naturally occurring thing. The idea of integrating different approaches is not something that naturally occurs, really. You can see it in evolution and things like that, but what I mean is naturally occurring is in terms of problem solving, troubleshooting. An integrative approach is the synthetic process of combining different approaches, right? Which means there's an immense power in that. It means that we're able to take old knowledge. I'm able to take old knowledge from my past, my history, my education. As human beings, as a human race, we're able to take knowledge from our entire history across any type of discipline and pick and choose what best fits to a specific problem. And I've hit that point probably 4 times now already because it's so invaluable to solving dynamic issues. And so moving on from just definitions of integrative studies and interdisciplinary studies and how they differ, I'll get now into talking about continuity and discontinuity. So this comes from an academic article written by Gabler, which we had to use for this presentation, which I found really informative, and especially since a lot of it is told from a first-person perspective of the author's life and the time they spent in Israel, how the country changed since they were young to when they were older and they went back with the person that accompanied them on the trip, and talking about how not only how individuals change and in some ways don't change, but also how their environments that they were in before, that they return to, change and in some ways don't change. And really just this kind of study, this almost meditation on the nature of not only change but also non-change or remaining static. And so to give you some examples of discontinuity, this idea of breaking away from the norm, not just the social norm of what's okay or not okay, but the trajectory. The specific article brought up this idea of a singular ascensive curve, right? This singular positive trajectory that one is supposed to stay on, a general, gradual curve of development of how a person is supposed to develop and change and grow. What we find is almost any individual you talk to has areas and moments and periods of time of discontinuity where they don't really follow that curve. Instead of this perfect straight curve, it's more of going up and down for a bit, and then up, sometimes with spikes, peaks, and valleys, and sometimes not even peaks and valleys averaging to a curve, but sometimes with long periods of downtime or long periods of uptick. So that's the discontinuity I'll be talking about. And I have 3 what we would call more negative examples and 3 more positive. Negative and positive being not their overall outcome or result, but just how we would view them, as an individual and carrying them in their life. And so the first one would be my dream school originally, because Texas Tech is not my first college, was to go to American University. But my family was not financially capable, so I went to Colorado State, which was a lot cheaper since my family and I lived in Colorado. So this was discontinuity because it was the first time I broke away from my intended trajectory of what I thought my life was going to be. Going to school in Colorado, getting out of Colorado, going to D.C., getting involved in international business studies, this kind of mediocre trajectory that I thought I was going to have. And also geographically staying in Colorado instead of moving, halfway across the country to the East Coast. The second example would be failing out of Colorado State University and going into a psych hospital, as that's a part of my story. As a person in long-term recovery, addiction is a major part of my story and my life. And today it's a tool. And integrative studies has played a huge role in using my addiction and that story as a tool to not only help people, but give me a different approach in my academics as well, which is really cool. It's something that I find I never thought would actually help in that type of way, but I'll get to that later. Don't we put the cart before the horse? And so failing out of CSU and going into that psych hospital, I not only, in this case, broke away from the intended trajectory that I had, that curve that I thought I was going to remain on of just staying in school and getting my 4-year degree and getting out, but my family's expectation of sending me to college that I should graduate, not fail out. And then my social and cultural expected, curve of, coming from a white Protestant background, a white Protestant upper middle class background in America, where one is expected to go to high school, graduate high school, go to college, graduate college, and either go to a master's program or become, enter into the workforce, into a professional, usually white-collar career, right? And so instead, I wound up in a psych hospital, which is pretty different, right? And it breaks away from my family norm in that curve as well, because both my parents graduated with undergrad degrees, and my sister at the time was about to be a senior in college on her way to graduating. So I broke away. There's an example of discontinuity from my individual, familial, and social societal trajectory. And the third and final one would be failing out of community college and going to a rehabilitation facility, aka rehab, to get clean. So this is when there is a great example of discontinuity, because it was when my family also stopped the trajectory of thinking I could just get a job and stay sober and work my way out of this, or I would just pull it together for long enough to go back to school. Instead, pulling away from that trajectory to, okay, this isn't about willpower. He needs medical help. He needs clinical therapeutic attention to get clean. And also, this is when the college option was taken away, right? This is when, okay, we're not looking at sending Travis back to school or getting him on that path. Like, this is when the discontinuity finally shifted my family's perspective on what needed to happen for me. At this point, I was too deep in my addiction to really make many decisions other than, yeah, I guess I'll, try to live, right? And it is also discontinuity because I moved from Colorado to New Mexico to go to that treatment facility, which was a big culture shock for me. I was born and raised in Colorado, and even though Colorado and New Mexico border each other, northern New Mexico is culturally very different from, middle Colorado, Colorado Springs, where I was born and raised. And the final way that was discontinuity is I broke away from the traditional values of, the traditional metrics for success or growth. I was in a rehabilitation facility struggling to stay sober, while most of the kids my age were at that point in their sophomore or junior years of college and looking at internships. So for the three positive examples of discontinuity, getting clean, first and foremost. The curve, the expected continuity, the normal, continuous equilibrium of basically what does one just keep doing for addiction is to use until you die. For severe substance use disorder, the natural trajectory is use until death. So getting clean is abnormal. It does not statistically fall into a normal. It is not it's not the statistical majority of cases, right? So finally hitting a bottom for me, getting engaged in a 12-step program, getting connected to a higher power of my own understanding, in a community of people to support me and guide me. That was discontinuity, breaking away from the trajectory of my addiction, and also it fits into the discontinuity narrative that the author talked about in the article, where they specifically reference 12 steps and how in 12-step meetings they talk about hitting a bottom, and from that bottom point of finally hitting a deep enough bottom is from there where you can start to go back up. And that's a discontinuous narrative. Instead of following a traditional curve, you have it go up and go down, hit bottom, and then come back up. And they both end in positive places, but one is continuous while one is discontinuous. And my life is very much an example of discontinuous narrative. And the second example of positive discontinuity would be getting into the collegiate recovery program at Texas Tech, which is a part of the Center for the Study of Addiction and Recovery. So there's individual discontinuity. Going back to college, a place that I already failed out of twice. Right? That is not something that fit with the norm of how Travis usually does at college, getting in, much less staying in. But also the social discontinuity of having a place on a major state university's campus, an entire environment for people to stay sober, abstinent from alcohol and drugs and substances, and support each other and give each other love, tutoring, advice, academic support, community on campus at a major state university. That most definitely breaks away from the traditional continuous narrative of, let's say, other student organizations or on-campus activities and programs, right? This one is for people that have already messed up bad in life and are now doing miraculously better. And the third positive example of discontinuity would be my first academic publication. I'm the first person in my family that I'm aware of to be published in a psychological journal, which was like an awesome moment of happiness and joy for my family and gratitude for me as an individual. Why I list it as an example of discontinuity is it's finally meeting the external sign of academic success, and not necessarily overachievement in a negative way, but not showing up and just doing the bare minimum, but doing more, right? Which breaks away from how I first did college, which was just show up and fail out, barely show up, right? And so breaking away from that old continuity into rather now doing things differently. And it fits also that discontinuity narrative of after the bottom, rising and continuing to rise. Something I'm extremely grateful and blessed to have in my life. And so comparing discontinuity and continuity over my lifetime and my history. And so looking at some discontinuity, how my values shifted. I was raised to be honest. Addiction taught me to be dishonest. Getting clean, I had to learn how to be honest again. And so it follows that narrative of high, low, high. And with several other values as well, such as family versus isolation, service to selfishness, selfishness back to service, intoxication to abstinence as values, right? And then in continuity, some values that stayed the same no matter what was going on in my life. Wanting to live and be alive, right? And perseverance as well. And the desire to seek and feel whole. And following the continuity of addiction like I addressed as well. I also followed the traditional continuity of going to treatment, going to a post-rehab recovery path via 12-step programs and sober living, a path that was well tread by people in front of me that helped me out. In terms of my life's trajectory, just in general where I'm at, post-graduation, I graduate in August, hopefully, fingers crossed, right? My hope is, I'm applying to and I hope to get into and pursue a master's in science from Texas Tech through the marriage and family therapy program, possibly a doctorate down the line, which would be an example of discontinuity, as no one in my family other than my mother's father has earned a doctorate degree. And so that'd be breaking away from even the expected norm there. And then, yet again, the expected norm of what should happen to people who are drug addicts and alcoholics. And then as well seeking professional career and collegiate recovery program development, like the program at Tech that gave me a second chance. And how I wound up at university studies, I originally began in psychology at Texas Tech, which is an amazing major, but I found it didn't really fit to what I truly wanted to do as a career, which was catering mainly towards more addiction and family dynamics revolving around addiction. My advisor told me about human sciences interdisciplinary studies, how you could combine 3 minors, called in that area concentrations, into a major, which would allow me to graduate with a bachelor's in science from the College of Human Sciences, but not be limited to just one school of thought, which is the definition of an interdisciplinary approach. So my 3 concentrations are psychology, community, family, and addiction studies, and addiction disorders and recovery studies. And this course alone this semester has really taught me how to take a step back in a much broader perspective on how to approach problems in a more integrative manner. In my life's trajectory, my family unit has changed from a nuclear family of 4 people to more splintered out. My mom lives in a different continent. My parents are looking at a divorce. It's not a bad thing, but those things just change over time, and so that's how discontinuity is changing. My traditional nuclear family to a more disjointed collection of individuals. Sister possibly moving across the country. We both lived in Colorado most of our lives, and now neither of us live there. So it's discontinuity for us as individuals, but as a family, we're kind of following the paths of our parents, which is when my parents became adults, they left the states, Texas, they were born in, to go build lives elsewhere. And then friendships, romantic relationships, a lot of examples of just people coming and going, but new additions, and different people bringing different things into my life, and that's positive discontinuity. It's keeping things fresh and changing. And as well, a close female friend of mine is a possible romantic interest, which is a little overly personal for presentation, but for me, it's 2 great examples of discontinuity wrapped into one. The first being the changing status of a relationship breaking up what I see in my life as a positive discontinuity, right? And also in my past, I usually blind dated, so dating someone that I've known for a really long time is a discontinuous behavior. And so in terms of connecting themes throughout all of my life, from before addiction, in addiction, and in recovery, now in college and being in recovery still, rebirth, the passing away of traditional paths and expectations to be replaced by new paths. From American to Colorado State to community college to rehab to sober living to Texas Tech, constantly these initial trajectories falling away to be replaced, trajectories and their accompanying expectations falling away to be replaced by new paths that seem to be increasingly better over time. As well, connection versus isolation. Alternating times of isolation with new periods of interpersonal growth and connection. The addiction, kind of alternating between those periods of isolation and hard times, alternating with interpersonal growth and connection with other people. The mirroring kind of opposite of the addiction downward spiral and tough times that I've had while sober, being characterized by isolation. While my successes and times of fulfillment have been characterized much more with fulfilling relationships with other people. And my individuality versus community, who I am as an individual versus the community that I'm a part of, and then of course combining new growth with old values. Bringing what I was taught as a child about honesty and respect and integrity into getting into recovery and what that looks like, staying sober and going to college. And finally, just looking at continuity in my life as a whole. So in addiction and recovery, in both aspects of those periods of my life, while they seem very different, I was always seeking self-fulfillment and peace. I was always seeking to feel okay and to be all right and to have something that would work to make Travis okay. Innovation and creativity. And addiction, it was a little more what we could say sketchy or shady. But it taught me how to do a lot of things differently. It taught me how to interact with people in a pretty unique way that I found, when used positively, was really immensely beneficial in recovery and even being in a collegiate environment. And perseverance, just pushing through, not dying in addiction and not giving up in recovery. And ultimately accepting help from others. That was the only way I was going to get out of addiction. And it's that humility that I was forced to have to actually get clean. That same message of humility is one that has taught me time and again to rely on others for growth, to help me out. My family values were consistent even until recently, and even then my family has more evolved to include close friends and growing relationships with my paternal grandparents along with my sister. And in both aspects of life I was always seeking belonging. And then geographically, which is big for me because movement always is like a big thing of where I'm at. So between Colorado, New Mexico, and Texas, the traditional white Protestant cultural values of success, such as seeking education, financial security, social esteem, and reputation, those were always consistent no matter where I was at geographically. Those were always the metrics by which not only I lived, but others kind of held me up to, including family and the society I was in. I also learned, a common theme between all three of those places. A community helps solve problems that are impossible to solve alone. In Colorado, it was a lot with, working with my family, and then addiction, my family getting me to treatment. In New Mexico, I had to rely on other clients to help me, a therapist, like relying on a community instead of just myself as my own capacities had failed in getting me sober. And then the last one and most important one, change is the only guarantee. And that's the thing I love most about integrative studies. Change is the only thing that is guaranteed in life, which means whatever solution I'm going with has to constantly be changing, coming from different facets and aspects. I know I've gone over time. Thank you so much for your time and listening to me today.